Hey guys, Chris here, and I'm a Ukrainian Canadian. Today is June 9th, 2024, and let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? Really big news today, and for the very first time in history, Ukraine managed to destroy an SU-57, and this is confirmed through satellite imagery from yesterday, which confirms some burn marks around the jet fighter, pretty much indicating that it has been damaged at the very least. Let's remember that this is Russia's latest, most modern jet fighter that they have, the 5th generation jet fighter, and it costs up to $35 million to produce it. And Russia so far has only 22 of them, and producing them is extremely expensive, especially now since Russia doesn't have the components as readily available as they used to be, right? They have to go through a bunch of other markets, purchase them through shell companies to be able to receive these very crucial Western components, because definitely the Russians have not been able to build the SU-57 with their own Russian-made components, whether it be chips, which we know they're behind, computer boards, whatever. The electronic systems is not something the Russians have innovated in whatsoever. So losing even one of them is an embarrassment for the Russians. And also the fact that they have been using them. They've not just been a prestige plane that they just kept on the side, like the T-14 Armata. They have been utilizing them, and they are carriers of the X-69 cruise missile, which have become more actively used against Ukraine in the last few months. So destroying them, of course, reduces the overall intensity of the use of these cruise missiles. And the most important thing as well is that it again confirms that the Ukrainians have free reign over Russian skies. The Russian air defense systems are not efficient, they're not functional, they cannot cover the Russian sky. And as a result of that, the Ukrainians can fly their long-range drones freely, and this airfield in question is in Akhtubinsk, which is about 600 kilometers away from Ukraine, so pretty far away. And you would think that such an important airbase would have somewhat of an air defense system, and they weren't able to stop small Ukrainian long-range drones. So this is a great news, and I can only hope that not only the Su-57s will get completely destroyed, but also the Russian Tupolev 95s, which they have been utilizing very frequently to conduct their terrorist operations in Ukraine by launching dozens of missiles every other day and striking civilian areas in Ukraine. So overall, great news, and we can only hope that the Ukrainians can strike and destroy more of Su-57s and other jet fighters and other bombers that the Russians have. Furthermore, some good news from Belgorod, and today an ammunition depot in the village of Centralne was not destroyed, but an ammunition depot that was close to the village was destroyed. And you can see that Russia is clearly hiding these ammunition depots in civilian areas. If you look at the village of Centralne, based on the imagery and the geolocation, the ammunition dump is literally right beside civilian housing. And that indicates that the Russians are trying to hide them there to add an additional safety layer, right? Like the Ukrainians won't be hitting civilian areas, but the Ukrainians have precise weaponry, which allows them to be very precise and avoid striking civilian areas, right? So that clearly backfired for the Russians, and I think that part of this strategy by the Ukrainians was to stop a possible Russian incursion in Sumy. If I show you guys on the map where Centralnoe is in Belgorod, it's actually towards the Sumy region. So if we go back to Belgorod, which is bordering right with the Kharkiv Oblast in Ukraine and Sumy Oblast, Centralnoe is actually about 30-50 kilometers away from the border with Ukraine. And you can see that when calculating the distance here, it's about actually 35 kilometers. So the Ukrainians struck an ammunition depot about 35-40 kilometers away from the border. And the Russians certainly were using this ammunition depot, preparing for an eventual attack on Sumy. We've talked about in the last few months, the Russians are interested in creating multiple fronts to destabilize the Ukrainian defenses in Donbass, reallocate certain assets in other regions, which could have been used to defend, let's say, Avdiivka region, Chasiv Yar, Bilohorivka, Kupiansk, right? It's all about destabilizing the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainians now, thankfully, we don't know what weapon was used here. Could have been a long-range drone, could have been a HIMARS missile, I don't know. It's still not confirmed, but since the Ukrainians now have the green light as well to utilize precise, well-developed Western weapons such as the HIMARS, Storm Shadows, Scalps, even bringing some Caesars or German Panzerhaubitze 2000s, which have a much longer range, they can strike deeper within Russia now without worrying that they're going to get a call from Washington or Paris or Berlin and telling them to stop it. So overall, this is good news. It indicates that, again, for the last few weeks, the Ukrainians have been striking Russia, and specifically military targets in Russia, and nothing happened. This entire nuclear saber rattling that the Russians have been threatening the entire world with, well, clearly it's a bluff. Again, we see that the Ukrainians have called out the Russians on that, and nothing is going on, right? They're not going to be using nuclear weapons, in my opinion, because it's not interesting for the Russians to strike in Ukraine, and that will directly impact the Russians as well, because Russia is right beside Ukraine, right? It's like bombing yourself almost. So I believe that that's a bluff by the Russians. So overall, that's the situation in Kharkiv and Sumy. But one last little thing before I go to my next slide, I wanted to give you guys an update on the Kharkiv situation, which is now very good for the Ukrainians. It's unconfirmed, but I've seen a lot of reports recently in the last day or two that the Ukrainians have been able to dislodge the Russians from the village of Hlyboke. You can see that this is the first offensive that the Russians begun last month, and it was really meant to go towards Kharkiv as close as possible. And you've seen that the last few weeks, the Russians have been stopped around Liptsi. So this is the small village right at the bottom here. And the Ukrainians are now striking on both sides, Hlyboke and Lukyantsy, and they've been able to apparently dislodge the Russian positions here. One thing I think has helped is that the Madyar Birds, if you guys don't know him, he has a unit of very skilled and experienced drone fighters and pilots, and they've been mostly operating in Kherson region, so the left bank of Kherson. And some of these units were moved in the last 2 or 3 weeks to Kharkiv to help with the defense of Kharkiv, and they've been very effective. I've seen so much footage of these drone pilots striking small Russian units trying to get through the forest or through roads in Kharkiv, and they've been very effective. So I think that in the next few days, we're going to get some good news from Hlyboke. And additionally, in Vovchansk, so that is the other front that the Russians have opened here, also unconfirmed reports indicating that the Ukrainians almost controlled the city entirely. They've been able to drive out the Russians from Vovchansk, and the Russians barely control 10% of the city. So it still remains to be confirmed. It's just really raw reports so far, but I really can't anticipate the Russians to do much more than what they have right now. They don't have enough resources, enough men, based on the amount of, you can see, brigades that they've moved and divisions. It's not enough to have a massive breakthrough here. They need much more men, at least 100,000, if not more. Far more armored vehicles, and they've lost so much already just in the past month. So I think the Ukrainians are turning the tide here, and it could be that by the end of the summer, the Ukrainians could drive the Russians entirely back to Russia from this area, which would be a huge win for Ukraine. But we have to see that. Again, I'm not anticipating that this is going to happen very quickly, but it can happen. And this will certainly be a big boost for the Ukraine morale, because unfortunately, we've seen that since September of last year, there hasn't been any Ukrainian gains or, a big victory like this. So I think that this is really important that Ukraine's focus on driving the Russians out of here. And this will provide a big morale boost for the Ukrainian forces, the Ukrainian people. And I think all of that is in line with the fact that the Ukrainians have been able to rearm. They've been rearmed by the West, and now they're turning the tide. And everywhere on the front line, I think that the Ukrainians will be able to stabilize the situation in certain areas, have small breakthroughs, take some villages back, and I think we're going to see the tide turn in Ukraine's favor. But that is based on the factor that the West continues to provide support to Ukraine, whether it be financial or military assistance. Ukraine needs to continue receiving that, because this is the lifeline for Ukraine. Let's face it, without that, we've seen that the Ukrainians were struggling without a steady supply of weaponry in the last 6 months before the military assistance package was passed in Washington. So this is really important. So that is one of the most important factors, because that is the factor that decides how successful the Ukrainian military is. It's not the only one, of course, but that is one of the most important. So that's the update for Sumy and Kharkiv region, and it's good to see that the Ukrainians can continue striking very large military targets in Russia, specifically in Belgorod, because we see that Belgorod covers so many Ukrainian, or borders so many Ukrainian oblasts, so the Russians are really operating heavily around Belgorod. Also Voronezh, but less in Voronezh, and also in Rostov. This is another very important oblast that the Ukrainians need to concentrate fire on as well. But Belgorod, since the Ukrainians control so much of the border here, they can operate more freely and strike far deeper within this oblast in Russia. Now, last but not least, I just want to share with you again unconfirmed reports. It could just be a small Russian ship, but a pro-Russian channel indicated that yesterday Ukraine might have been able to sink and destroy a Russian landing ship in Yeysk, and that is in Krasnodar, if I remember correctly. And it's unconfirmed, but it appears that locals were saying that they've heard massive explosions close to the port of Yeysk, and there was a Russian landing ship that was present. But again, it could be a small Russian patrol ship, which would be great either way. But we know how valuable landing ships are for the Russians, especially in the situation that Russia will lose the Kerch Bridge, which I think is going to happen. It's inevitable. It's a matter of time. And the Ukrainians are simply degrading Russia's ability to resupply the Crimean Peninsula, whether it be just with basic food, medical supplies, its military. They need the ships. They need these cargo ships, these ferries. Remember, last week, I believe the Ukrainians sunk 2 ferries, the Congo Trader, something like that, and another one, the Avant-Garde ferry. And now they're focusing on the landing ships, which Russia has a few of, and Ukraine already has destroyed a few of them as well. So overall, this is an indication that the Ukrainians are certainly planning an operation on the Kerch Bridge. It's going to happen probably by the end of the summer. I hope it's going to happen in the next few weeks, by the end of July or early July. And we should be anticipating the Kerch Bridge to be fully destroyed, not just damaged, but fully destroyed. Again, the Kerch Bridge was destroyed or damaged twice in the past, but it was just a small section. Ukraine really needs to ensure that this time, this is going to be the final attack that will destroy a huge span of the bridge, at least a few hundred meters, so the Russians won't have any ability to rebuild it quick enough, right? Because if it's a small section of 25-50 meters, Russia has shown that they're capable of repairing it in a few months. Again, what we need to also acknowledge is that the Russians don't have as much reliance on the Kerch Bridge as they used to even a year ago. So although this is still important to destroy, it's a key transportation link for the Russians, they have found different ways. And of course, they didn't have the choice. When Ukraine damaged the bridge the first 2 times, first, I believe in October of 2022, and then last year in June, July of 2023, the Russians had to adapt, right? They still have millions of people living in Crimea, soldiers, troops, and civilians that they need to resupply. So they had to adapt. They built a new railway link between Rostov and Crimea. They also have ships, evidently, so they will still have some ways to bring supplies, but this will be far more costly and difficult for the Russians. So again, it's an unconfirmed news. I hope it's going to be true, but we'll see next few days once we get more satellite confirmation that indeed there was a landing ship present in Yeysk. And just to remind my viewers where Yeysk is, it is really, I believe it's here. Yeah, it's really in the Sea of Azov, actually, close to Mariupol and Berdyansk. So the Russians evidently were using Yeysk to resupply Mariupol and Berdyansk as well. This is not just a Crimea thing. This is a vital link to resupply the occupied Ukrainian cities by Russia, whether it be Novozovsk, Mariupol, Berdyansk. These are very important cities, and especially Berdyansk, because Berdyansk has a big port. So the Russians have this key connection here. So this is, again, another alternative link that the Russians have. Rather than having to go through Crimea by railway link, they can, send some cargo ships, landing ships between Yeysk and Berdyansk. The distance is about 100 kilometers at best, if I'm calculating. Yeah, 100 kilometers, literally. Just a little bit over 100 kilometers. So, that's less than an hour and a half of a trip for a ship. So, that's not so far for them. And again, as I've been saying, that's what the Russians are trying to do. They're trying to find alternative ways that they can resupply. And so this is good that the Ukrainians are removing that alternativity for the Russians, or that alternative. That's the video for today, guys. I hope you enjoy my update. A huge thank you for supporting this channel, but also supporting the Ukraine cause, which whatever way you can, I am very thankful for that. A huge thank you for watching my videos. Please leave me a comment in the comment section below about what you think on the topics that I covered today. And leave me a like if you enjoy my content. A huge thank you, and I will see you guys in the next one. Slava Ukraini!